We have with us today Father Anthony Cekada here at St. Gertrude the Great in Ohio. And we're here to talk to Father about something fairly complex, but has been more controversial in the last 5 years, particularly dating back to around 2006, 2005, and a little bit before then. But something that has been in the visceral consciousness or subconsciousness of traditional Catholics for some time, which is what are we to do with the new sacraments? That question all goes back to, do we have valid bishops or not? So you can argue about confirmation, you can argue about baptism, all of that, but if you don't have valid bishops, none of it really holds together. So, Father, as always, when we have been doing this series of interviews, we always go back to the beginning. And for you, this beginning is somewhere in Switzerland, maybe in a hallway or in a classroom with Archbishop Lefebvre.
Yes.
And you were, as always, asking questions, because that's something you've been doing for quite some time. And take us back to that point. Why were you asking him a question? What was the question you were asking him about? And what was the Archbishop's answer?
I went to see Archbishop Lefebvre during my first year at St. Pius X Seminary in Icone to ask him about the case of friends of mine in the seminary in Milwaukee who might be interested in the traditional Mass, might be interested in working with the traditionalist movement. So I asked the Archbishop, would it be permissible for them after they were ordained to come and work with us? Would, in effect, their ordinations be okay? The Archbishop told me that, well, he saw a difficulty and a doubt with the new rite of priestly ordination that Paul VI had promulgated, that he felt that the form there was doubtful. As regards the Rite of Episcopal Consecration, he told me that there's a bigger problem there. They had completely changed the form in 1968, and as far as he was concerned, it was invalid. This was the first time that I had ever heard this, and it was quite surprising.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I do think that the Archbishop used the new rite of ordination at a ordination ceremony at Fontainebleau, or one of the French Benedictine monasteries at one point. Is that correct?
I believe so, and that was for the ordination, I think, of the Abbé Cotard. That's something I had heard about later.
But at the time, do you think that would have squared with... So his doubt was specifically with Episcopal consecration, not so much with priestly ordination? That's why he may have used the new form?
Well, he said that the new form for Episcopal consecration was completely changed and invalid, and he regarded the new form for priestly ordination as doubtful.
But yet he participated in the ceremony at some point later.
Yes, but he who knows exactly what he did. He could have used the old form. Because it's something as a bishop you would probably remember.
Well, and again, yeah. This isn't exactly in the scope of the interview, because I do want to set the stage that the Archbishop did have an opinion about this early on, but that some might say, well, clearly the Archbishop didn't really have any doubts. Maybe he was just talking to Father Cekada in the hallway and it was a passing opinion, but he wasn't really, Father Cekada's memory is fuzzy, he's getting old, he doesn't really remember, and so I want to make sure that it's clear that you clearly remember the Archbishop expressing this doubt regarding the new Rite of Episcopal Consecration. And for you, this is where this journey of researching this began initially. This was the first time you'd heard it.
Yes, this is the first time I had heard this anywhere.
And to hear it from someone who was a bishop.
Yes, that was significant, to say the least.
So that was way back before you were even a priest, Father.
Yes,
that was
75, 76.
Long time ago.
Yeah.
but we're here now. It's 2011. It's going to be 2012 soon. When did you first start really looking at this topic, and why? I think partly because for you, coming up as a priest ordained by a bishop who was ordained in the old rite, this wasn't of direct concern to you. You
No.
probably had bigger fish to fry in the meantime. When did this become more of interest to you?
Well, as the years rolled by, occasionally you would hear of priests who were interested in saying the traditional Mass. Naturally, you would wonder whether or not, if they put into practice, put into effect their desire to say the traditional Mass, whether or not they were indeed validly ordained priests.
This was a point that you brought up in the letter of the 9.
Yes. This was part of our difficulties with Archbishop Lefebvre in 1983, that there was one priest who had been ordained in the new rite, who was working with the society in the United States, and he wouldn't submit to conditional reordination. So we thought that that was a major problem, major difficulty, because there's a question of doubt about his sacraments. So that was one of the points of dispute. That was the new rite of priestly ordination that was questionable. That naturally led to a consideration of the new rite of Episcopal Consecration as well. How was one to look upon that?
So when you were thinking about what to study, was the idea, I might as well study consecration because if I study the priestly ordination issue, I'm going to still have to go back further?
Yeah, you go to the root of it because it's from the episcopacy. The priesthood is derived and passed on, and in the new rite of Episcopal Consecration, as a result of my conversation with Archbishop Lefebvre, I knew that there was a greater problem with that, and that one should begin by studying that.
So in, shall we say, modern times, or in the most recent years, this problem probably came to the fore. For conservative Catholics, or even some traditionalists, there was great excitement, the election of Benedict XVI. Mm-hmm. But some wary traditionalists brought out what would not have been advertised on EWTN that day, which was that Benedict XVI was not consecrated in the old rite.
Yes,
he was indeed
that's right.
consecrated in the new rite, and it was yet another aha moment for people to say, well, as you cite in one of your articles, Father Pulvermacher once said, when they have no more priests left, they'll allow the Latin Mass.
Yes, yeah.
When there are no more priests left, or no more bishops left, they'll then elect a pope. So this becomes of immediate interest, where
Yes.
it might have been boiling in the background for you. There was a study group in France who had done some work on this, and for those of us in the English-speaking world, we barely read anything in English, much less anything written by the frogs. Can you tell us a little, as someone who's a bit more familiar with what's being written in France, what this was, because it's probably unknown.
It was a group of people that call themselves Rore Sanctifica, and the name of the group was derived from a phrase in the essential form in the Rite of Episcopal Consecration. They studied and brought together documents about the new Rite of Episcopal Consecration. They brought together documents from different sources, in effect refuting the idea that there was some connection, or that there was a strong connection between the Rite of Episcopal Consecration in the Eastern rites and what was done after Vatican II in the new rites of Paul VI. They put together a vast body of material on this.
Which is unfortunately still all in French only.
Yes, but if you want to really get to the bottom of things in theology, you have to understand at least some French. Theology and food.
So that was out. At least the first volume came out in 2005. Mm-hmm. Not that much later, there was an immediate well, I shouldn't say not immediate. There was a very quick response in the French district of the Society of St. Pius X. Not directly by the Society of St. Pius X, but by one of the collaborating religious orders. So the Dominicans at Avrier, through Father Pierre-Marie, wrote an article, Why the New Rite of Episcopal Consecration May Be Valid, which was translated in English as Why the New Rite of Episcopal Consecration Is Valid. And as you pointed out, I got the same article because I was a subscriber to the Angelus at the time. It was this big, double-wide, very colorful article, the translation of Father Pierre-Marie's Cell de la Terre article. And when you got this, what did you think?
Well, I thought, what's going on here? Because it, as I read the article, it was obviously an apologia, a justification, attempted a justification for the validity of the new rite of Episcopal Consecration. Naturally, I thought right away, well, why are they doing this? And being, I suppose, a somewhat suspicious soul, I thought this must have something to do with their ongoing negotiations for recognition by the Vatican, because you can't very well go negotiate with different bishops in the Vatican if people in the organization believe that these bishops are not in fact bishops. So I thought that it was somehow tied with that.
I want to hit pause here for a moment, Father, insofar as your own suspicion in the Northeast District back in the 80s about the sacraments of priesthood coming from the Novus Ordo. This was not a clerical, elitist opinion. This was very much down in the trenches that there was a visceral suspicion on the part of the faithful to this as well. And to present day in Society Faithful, those that I have encountered to this day and hour, there are those who won't have anything to do with people who've been ordained in the Novus Ordo. So I don't want to say it's a dirty little secret, because I don't think it's dirty, nor is it little, nor is it a secret. But most of the faithful of the Society of St. Pius X are also suspicious here. And I think they would share your suspicions of why does this have to be brought up, and why are you trying to convince?
Yeah, I think that in my experience, the suspicion was fairly widely spread. Certainly in the 70s and 80s, even before our difficulties with the society and with Archbishop Lefebvre, and that's something that has continued. And I've heard that even in certain motu proprio groups, groups that are affiliated with different dioceses, that some people will not go to a mass if it is celebrated by a priest who has been ordained by a bishop consecrated in the new rite.
It starts to get a bit complicated, doesn't it?
It gets very complicated.
So in the light of complication, as you read Father Pierre-Marie's article, were you writing and taking notes in terms of thinking about how you'd write your own article, or did you not consider that article at all when you were thinking about writing your own piece on this?
Actually, I'd been thinking about writing an article on this for several years before, because I figured eventually it was an issue that would come up, inevitably. And so I'd gathered actually a fair amount of material on some of the questions that Father Pierre-Marie brought up. So when I saw his article, I thought, well, I suppose I'm going to have to write an article to deal with this somehow. My initial impression of his article was that it was rather difficult to follow and didn't deal with some key questions. So I thought that I would have to look very closely at his article and then try to systematize everything and lay it all out as best as I could in my own study.
And I suppose that's where we're going to go to now, Father, to talk about your study. And as always, whenever we've been doing this series of interviews, we always recommend for people to go to traditionalmass.org, read the article yourself, look at the footnotes, look those footnotes up to make sure you call out Father and make sure that he's not pulling stuff out of context. That's something that he prides himself on not doing. But whatever we cover today in the interview isn't going to be everything, but we hope that it will be a good enough overview to allow you to study the question further. By no means should you necessarily consider the question settled today, but I hope that if you're open-minded, you'll be open-minded enough to start doing some research on your own. And with that being said, we're going to have to get into stuff that goes beyond what normal laymen have to do. And Father, I read these articles when they came out, and in preparation for this interview, I've read them a couple times, and I have to say, even as
Lucky you.
as a truly Catholic nerd, and someone who, would have been the kid in catechism class saying me, and asking to do extra homework, not just because I'm part Asian, but because I love this stuff. This is still quite difficult for the average layman. So let's start by talking about sacramental theology. And here, this is stuff that's fairly basic that a child is going to learn in preparation for confirmation. But what is necessary for the validity of any sacrament, not just Episcopal consecration?
Okay. We all know that a sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So we memorize that in second grade. There are certain elements that in a sacramental rite that have to be present there before it can give the grace. So you have to have the matter, which is the external physical sign, and you have to have the form, which is an essential formula that expresses what's taking place on a sacramental level.
So can you give an example of that, Father?
Yeah, well, everyone knows baptism. So, what do we do? Well, emergency baptism, you get the baby, you pour water on the baby's head, and you say, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The matter is the water applied to the head of the baby, and the form is the formula that you recite. So that affects the sacrament. That does it.
It is fairly new in church history that, well, let me back up. It is fairly recent in modern times that Pius XII defined the form for holy orders. Mm-hmm. Prior to Pius XII, what was the understanding in the church regarding matter and form for the priesthood?
Well, there were, it was something that the church actually had not defined. And so you had different opinions among theologians as to what it consisted of. There's something, I think, like 9 different opinions. But in any event, Pius the 12th settled what it would be for diaconate, for priesthood, and for episcopacy.
And this was in Sacramentum Ordinis?
Sacramentum Ordinis. And for all 3 of those orders, he said it would be the imposition of hands by the bishop on the head of the person receiving the order. And then for each order, he said, he designated what on the rite was the essential form. So one sentence in the diaconal rite, he designated one sentence in the rite for priestly ordination, one sentence in the rite for episcopal consecration. And those he decreed would be the essential sacramental form.
So the equivalent of the I baptize you.
That's correct.
So prior to Pius XII, this had not been defined, but under Pius XII, it was defined.
Yes, that's correct.
And for those of us as laymen who aren't familiar with how this isn't a matter of the Pope, sitting at his desk saying, well, what do we have to cover this week? Oh, I need to cover that. Okay, well, let me just write this out. That coming to this was a group project.
Yes.
That people had to study this, figure out what made sense, and then it had to be imposed on the church. Now, here's where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, Father. And so I'm trying to speak slowly, for not only for myself, but for I think anyone who's trying to follow along. There's an additional issue regarding the form here, is that the power of the order has to be univocally expressed. Now, what does univocally mean?
Well, let's back up a little bit. Pius the 12th and the theologians commenting on his on Sacramentum Ordinis said that the the form for each order, for diaconate, for priesthood, and for episcopacy, has to express two things. The grace of the Holy Ghost, that's not difficult to understand, and the specific order being received, whether it's diaconate, priesthood, or the episcopate. So you have two things in the sacramental form. And if you look at each one of the forms that he designated, they had that.
The power of order and the grace of the Holy Ghost.
Grace of the Holy Ghost. And the Rore Sanctifica business that that was the name of the website, was the symbolic way, the dew of the Holy Ghost, as it were. That's how that was expressed. And then for episcopacy, and then you had the element in there of the fullness of the priesthood, the fullness of the ministry that is being conveyed on the bishop. So you had those two elements in there, the order and the Holy Ghost. Then the next question, which you raised, was univocally. In other words, without ambiguity. So those two elements have to be expressed in the sacramental form in such a way that it's clear what's being expressed. And that's what's required.
And to not be ambiguous here, Father, what you mean is, in the context of the prayer, that there's no possible dual meaning for the phrase or the word? Is that what it's meant by
yes.
not being ambiguous?
Yes, and
because we use words for different things in English and in Latin.
Correct, and this element of clarity, I suppose, has to be there.
Okay.
So that's the general principle, and then you find that carried out in each one of the forms that he describes, that he designates.
So that's how it was prior to the council.
Right.
We've done other pieces, other interviews, Father, where we've talked about the changes in the liturgy and that sort of thing. And there is somewhat of the same spirit going on with the changes to Episcopal Consecration that was going on with the Mass, where you had a group of people who wanted to talk about returning to older, more primitive ways. Mm-hmm. I think it's just probably surprising in the sense that Pius XII had just formalized this just in the previous, just one or two papacies back, mm-hmm. and that this had to be changed. We can say that, the Mass had already started to undergo changes under Holy Week, mm-hmm. as the sort of cautionary, but they just sort of dove right in with Episcopal Consecration because that had just recently been done. It wasn't ancient. It had recently been defined, rather. So the new rite of Episcopal Consecration is as follows, and we're going to keep referring back to this prayer, so this isn't the only time that I'm going to cite it. But it says, "So now pour out upon this chosen one that power which is from you, the governing Spirit, whom you gave to your beloved Son, Jesus Christ, the Spirit given by him to the holy apostles, who founded the church in every place to be your temple for the unceasing glory and praise of your name." So before we go into this any further, I would say this is where laymen fear to tread. Because one, we haven't been given proper theological training, specifically not sacramental theology. Mm-hmm. So any layman who wants to simply wander into this and not think that they're going to spend hours and hours and hours and hours and days and weeks mm-hmm. properly studying this, I think, is foolish. Mm-hmm. That being said, for those who possess a Catholic sense, on a superficial reading, doesn't seem to be very objectionable. We see governing Spirit, mm-hmm. we see holy apostles, we see founded the church, this chosen one, this power. So it seems that there is a prayer being said for a power to be conveyed on someone who's related to the apostles, mm-hmm. in a sort of vague way. But I think that starts us with a very problem we talked about just now, which was we don't want to be vague. We want to be clear. Mm-hmm. So what is perhaps the most problematic phrase that we see in this whole prayer?
Well, there is the problematic phrase that you see, is the governing spirit, the spiritus principalis. That is problematic because you don't see one of the other elements of the sacramental form, which is the actual order that's being given. So it's not what is actually taking place, is supposed to be taking place at a sacramental level, is not conveyed by that.
So back to the original point of conveying the fullness, the power of the order, and the grace of the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
The Spiritus Principalis is not referring to the power of the order.
Yeah, well, the study demonstrates that one is not really sure what it's referring to, because it's a term that is used in and given many different senses and many different meanings. I came up, I think, in my article with 12 different meanings.
That's quite a few, Father. I think we started with, I think one of the things you pointed out is it occurs in Psalm 50:14, but that in that psalm, there's not obviously a specific relation to the notion of the New Testament episcopacy.
No, there isn't.
Or any of its predecessors. And then you cited some other issues. Now, I think part of the problem is with understanding the Latin and the Greek that are at work here, and obviously understanding it as governing spirit in the vernacular. That's just how we're understanding it, but it's not really the best way to look at this question. It's not really best to judge it from the English phrase governing spirit, but to look at it in the Latin. And so that's what you did in the article. You're talking about what governing means and how that relates to the role of a bishop. Now, what's important to note is that, as we talked about with the Ottaviani intervention, that there was early on questions about what was going on here. This wasn't something discovered by Father Cekada and the French guys recently. But that in the meetings in which these changes were being proposed, one of the members of the committee working on this raised the question. So it was even raised prior to publication. There wasn't an intervention after. There was an intervention during.
Yes, there was a question right away from the beginning, and a difficulty right away from the beginning, the meaning of this phrase in the essential, what Paul VI has designated as the essential sacramental form for the new Rite of Episcopal Consecration.
It was in October 1966 from an Opus Dei bishop.
Yes, and the study group that was putting this right together, I think, was study group 20, and this bishop asked the question, well, what exactly does this convey? Does it really convey correctly the idea of the episcopacy as it is understood? It's not recorded whether or not he ever received a response, but this is someone who, he's a bishop, he's trained in theology and canon law, and he's raising this question right away about Spiritus Principalis.
Well, maybe he was sent off to Africa and never heard from again.
Perhaps, yeah. But so this was raised right away at the beginning. After the new rite of Episcopal Consecration was promulgated by Paul VI, the meaning of this phrase was raised as well because translators into the modern languages were having a difficult time trying to figure out how to translate it. So the first translation into English for Spiritus Principalis was an excellent spirit. So give this guy an excellent spirit. And in I forget exactly what it was into French, but
I think it was the spirit that makes chiefs.
Yes, a spirit that makes chiefs.
Not
presumably,
chefs.
Not chefs. Although that's nearly sacramental in France too, I hear. So the translators had problems with this right away. So you find then in the magazine of the group that was responsible for the liturgical reform in Concilium's magazine, Notitiae, you find two articles in one issue that actually relate to the question of the meaning of sacramental forms and how they're to be understood and translated. So you find a general article in there talking about the problems translating the meanings of sacramental forms. And then a few pages later, you find another article about how the phrase spiritus principalis should be translated. That there have been questions that have been raised about this. So this signals that there's a real problem here, because you can't, it's raising the question in one part, one section of Notitiae about the actual validity of sacramental forms. And then there's the second article by Dom Bott, who was responsible for putting together the new form, trying to explain how it should be translated. So that's a sign, really, that they're...
Preemptive strikes.
Yes.
So now this is how we translate it into governing spirit. So we went from an excellent spirit, or the German was spirit of a guide. I suppose that was the Sacagawea translation.
I think so.
So we went from that to governing spirit.
Yes.
So that was the phrase that we're looking at. But this is still not univocal by definition. And why would you argue that, Father?
Well, what does it mean? How is that to be understood?
Well, a bishop governs the church, a governing spirit.
Yeah, Joe Biden governs the Senate, maybe, and he's got the governing spirit. But it's not, the problem is it's not standard theological language that tells you what a bishop does. If anything, it doesn't convey the idea of a sacrament as much as it might convey the idea of some sort of a jurisdiction, which obviously a bishop has, but that's not the whole story.
And you talked about having a dozen possible meanings for governing spirit. Where were some of your sources for these meanings?
Oh, well, I mean, again, it was a real rabbit hole. You found the different explanations that, say, Dom Bott tried to give in his explanation, Notitiae magazine. You look at how it's understood in Psalm 50, where it occurs. You see maybe how different fathers of the church used it. And what happens is I went through a whole bunch of them, at least a dozen, all these different sources. And I went through a dozen sources and came up with a dozen different meanings. And the real cherry on top was there's a statement by Bott, before this was designated, I think, as the essential sacramental form, of saying that, well, this phrase with spiritus principalis, and it really wasn't necessary for the validity of an Episcopal consecration. So you end up with language in the essential sacramental form for Episcopal consecration where it is virtually impossible to say with certainty and affirm with a straight face what it actually means.
All right, Father, let's grant that you're right. Let's say that you did your homework, you found out that there were all these different meanings. As a result, you pointed out and said there's not a univocal signification of what governing spirit is.
Right.
It's not clearly defined in sacramental theology, nor has it really ever been used in the Roman Rite. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a nice little easy trapdoor, Father, which is, well, it's probably been used in the Eastern Rite.
Okay.
And this was how we got lots of changes. This is how we got the anaphora of Hippolytus.
Yes.
Fastest epiclesis in the West.
Yes. Someone said that, I think.
Yes. Yeah. In the Mass. We use the Eastern Rite in order to come up with this, and the Eastern Rite's valid. Therefore, this is valid.
Well, good, and the underlying principle, of course, and it's enunciated by Pius XII is correct, that if something has been used as a sacramental form in the Eastern Rite, recognized as such, it is to be considered as valid. And the underlying principle there is entirely correct. The difficulty is that what was designated here in the 1968 Rite of Episcopal Consecration as the essential sacramental form was not, in fact, a sacramental form in the Eastern Rite. And the different sources that were given to attempt to justify it as such proved not to be what they were claimed to be. So if you take
that there was the testament of our Lord,
etc.
Yeah,
well,
those sound pretty serious, Father.
Let's take those first. The ones that the apostolic tradition, the testament of our Lord, etc. Those actually are of doubtful, of questionable authorship, and the experts in manuscripts and in the Eastern Rites really do not regard these texts as terribly reliable, and there is a question as to whether or not they were ever used liturgically, and then a question of by whom were they used liturgically. And in some cases, they were used by heretics liturgically. So that's not much of a recommendation for it. Apart from that, you have actual Eastern Rite texts. You have the Coptic Rite. The Copts, of course, are Egyptians, and they were rather isolated from the rest of the church because of the persecution by the Muslims, and they were, I believe, Monophysite heretics, and then eventually there was a group of them that joined the Catholic Church. So if one would hear that, well, no, actually this rite of Paul VI for Episcopal consecration is derived from the same thing as the Coptic Rite. Well, if you go and you looked at what the form was in the Coptic Rite, you would see that there are things that were missing from it, that were in the Coptic Rite, rather, that were not included in the Rite of Paul VI. So that was a fraudulent argument. Then if you went to the two other rites, which were cited as the sources for the Rite of Paul VI, either the Syriac Rite or the Maronite rites, you would find in those cases that what is considered to be the essential sacramental forms were in fact other prayers. That in both of those cases, there were texts that somewhat, in both of those rites, there were texts that somewhat resembled the Episcopal consecration rite form of Paul VI, but actually were non-sacramental rites. They were used to install someone, let's say, as a patriarch. So in none of the cases that were cited in the Eastern rites was this text used actually as a sacramental form.
This reminds me of our discussion about the new Mass and talking about Eucharistic prayer number 2. Fool me once, shame on, shame on you. I have to be careful. President Bush messed it up, and now I'm going to mess it up. But we've seen this pattern before, so we see it in the Mass, and so when we're watching it here, that you have this fraudulent text, or at least doubtful, or ambiguous, or a composite, or a reconstruction, and we say, well, this is the text, and Emperor's New Clothes try to get you to believe that, then we really have to go back and look at the text, as you pointed out, and say, well, is this actually a sacramental form that was used in the Eastern Rite? So therefore we can use it. Mm-hmm. The other issue is something that's different in liturgical praxis for us in the West as opposed to the East, and probably this goes back to the heavy influence of St. Thomas here. But for the Eastern Rite, it's lengthy. So I don't want to say the sentence goes on for a long time, but the form is much longer. So when we think of sacramental form for the Eastern Rite, it's not, as Pius XII designated, one sentence here.
That's correct. And if you look at the, if you look at the commentaries, though, of Western Latin Rite theologians such as Capello, they tell you which parts of the rites are considered the sacramental form. And in most cases, at least for the forms for holy orders, these are very, very long prayers. So it's not just a question of one sentence. It's a question of one prayer or sometimes even a series of prayers.
So your argument, and when this is sort of brought up as an objection to you, which it was in subsequent articles, your answer is that, first of all, some of these are non-reliable sources.
Yes.
But secondly, even if they were reliable sources, they are not given over in the complete way in which we're simply we're taking Kyrie eleison, that's Greek, and we're importing that into a Latin liturgy. In the same sense, we're not simply lifting a valid sacramental form and dropping it into a Western liturgy. We're taking bits and pieces, some of it not even part of the essential form, and then dropping it into a prayer and saying, there you go.
Or even worse than that, that we think that we've reconstructed a text. So the whole question of the source that was used for the Rite of Episcopal Consecration of Paul VI was taken from the writings of Dom Bernard Bot, and the great life's work was this work called the Apostolic Tradition of Hippolytus, an attempt at a reconstruction. So he gave us an attempted reconstruction. So we don't even know, the only authority that we have for that is Bott's scholarly opinion.
All right, Father, so let's grant that you're right about it not being univocal. We'll grant that it's ambiguous. We'll grant further that we didn't get this from the Eastern Rite. It was at best the best of a bad job in trying to forge an Eastern Rite connection.
Okay.
So there's no Eastern connection.
Right.
Or a French one for that matter. So I'm now left with the fact that I have a Catholic bishop, and let's say that he's consecrated in the old Rite of Episcopal Consecration, Father. He is putting his hands on a priest, along with a couple sets of hands from some assisting bishops, and he's in a ceremony in the context of which he's trying to make someone a bishop. He's laying on his hands, he's saying prayers that are related to this. I'm just a simple layman. Looks like a bishop, a bishop's getting consecrated to me. I mean, this is kind of complicated at this point. So don't we have some context here? Can't we, as Catholics, we're always told to read in context. We're told not to pull out one thing and kind of proof text it like Protestants do and say, see, this is why you're wrong. Can't we just look at the context of the ceremony and say, I've got a bishop putting his hands on someone else, and he's getting dressed up in these really beautiful new vestments?
Two things. First of all, that's very much the tendency of modern theology and modernist theology. That, the details, don't sweat the details, the small stuff, it's all small stuff. That you don't have to worry about magic words. Context is everything. As long as generally you get everything right, it's going to be fine.
So whatever works.
Yeah, whatever works for you is good, and that this context sort of takes care of it. Well, that's essentially modernist theology, which rejects the idea of an essential sacramental form. The reason that traditional theology speaks of an essential sacramental form is the sacrament is a sign, it has to signify. And at a certain point in the ceremony, you have to say that it's signified sufficiently to affect what it signifies. Are you completely confused by that? But that's the idea, that this is the minimum that you have to get right. That's the essential sacramental form. If you do not have that, the context does not matter. Let me give you an example of, let's say Father Larrabee performing this baptism again on Sunday, and he recites all of the prayers before in the exorcism and puts salt in the baby's mouth and the baby cries, and leads the baby into the church with the godparents. But let's say that he omits the essential sacramental form. I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Well, it's the context of a baptismal ceremony. So if you're operating under context, you would say, well, that doesn't make any difference just because it's the context of a baptismal ceremony, the baby's baptized. Or if you, or say, let's say he omits one or two of the words, that I baptize you in the name of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Or if he simply says, I baptize. The context won't cure that, because something essential in the sign is missing, even though he's gone through all of the rest of the ceremony. And that's how traditional Catholic theology works.
Well, in part of the objections that were brought up to your article, Father Cellier had brought up the objection you're talking about context, and this was, I would say, augmented by an article by Father Alvaro Calderon, who teaches for the Society Seminary down in La Reja. And I'll quote from his reply. Thus, it follows that the imposition of hands is a sufficient matter for holy orders because they are the hands of a bishop, and that a formula even a bit vague suffices because it is a mouth of a bishop, a will of a bishop, who expresses his determination to transmit the power that he possesses in its fullness, to beget from his own full priesthood a priest or a bishop. So this goes back to the scenario that I was saying, is that if I'm a bishop and I put my hands on you and I say, I want you to be a bishop, you're arguing that that's not enough.
Correct. And to Father Calderon, I would say, dove scritto. In other words, where the heck is that written? What theologian who would be worth his salt, who had a reputation in Catholic theology, would say that.
Well, because this phrase is a bit interesting, if the formula is even a bit vague.
Yeah, and that overthrows the whole idea of the form being univocal and a form actually signifying. If it's vague, it doesn't signify. So, in that little sentence or two sentences, he overthrows all of the givens of Catholic sacramental theology.
Well, I think taking us back to the beginning, Father, and talking about sacramentum ordinis, even a bit vague is not a phrase in Latin or English that I would imagine appeering in that document as something that's acceptable. But I think what's more disturbing for me as a layman, again, because I'm unqualified, and I think most 99.9% of laymen are unqualified to dispute in these matters, but we're not unqualified in order to understand some of the insights, that a priest, even if he's simply doing it in an academic way, responding to something you've written, it seems that such a sentence doesn't really take this seriously, to say that a formula even a bit vague suffices, when that goes against what the principles of sacramental theology are, which is specifically to combat against vagaries. This is something we're taught in catechism when we're being taught about what a valid baptism is, and this is something all school children are taught.
This is what you have to get as the minimum.
And there's no context in which it says, well, even if this is a bit vague, then that's going to be okay. So, and I think part of that is there needs to be, when I see wording and phraseology like that, I see an agenda-driven response. So there is a certain party line that I have to take. Therefore, I'm going to come up with something in response to you that keeps my party line, but not one that's going to require too much work. And I think for the casual lay reader, as I stipulated in that scenario I presented to you before, it sounds pretty good. But when we take a deeper look at it and contextualize it with what we've learned about basic sacraments that are not as complicated as episcopal consecration, when we learn about baptism, say vagaries are not even part of Catholic spirit, Catholic orientation towards the sacraments. It's never been about being vague. It's always been about being clear.
Yeah, you will not find that type of teaching in any manual on sacramental theology.
And I suppose, Father, I could maybe accept this this explanation from Father Calderon prior to Pius XII, because as you said, there were different opinions as to what it was. So while I disagree with the spirit of the argument, I could argue that, well, it's not entirely clear. The most famous example being the Traditio from the Council of Florence, that Pius XII said, well, even if the church did attach it for validity, I do not say, by the way, I'm the head of the church, that this is required. Or rather, he probably would have said we.
We, yes.
But that being said, after Pius XII, such a sentence, such a defense is really inadmissible.
That's correct. Yeah.
And I find it a bit impoverished. And again, I don't think this is about being partisan. I think that traditional Catholics need to be honest with themselves and say this isn't about defending, my priest or the congregation that services my chapel.
Let me say this, though, that life would be a lot easier in one sense if in dealing with priests who are ordained in the Novus Ordo, in the new system, if their sacraments were valid. You have to, now you have to go through all of this and explain to them that in effect they've been cheated by these modernists who've done all these horrible things to the sacramental rites. It would be a lot easier if it were valid.
Well, and I suppose that kind of dovetails into our conclusion, Father. I mean, if we are here, well, I'll back up one step prior to the conclusion. Normally speaking, in a dispute like this, one could say this would have characterized maybe some of the ferment leading up to Apostolicae Curiae or to Humanae Vitae, where there was some somewhat allowed discussion. We were allowed to think some thoughts that we could not think. It would have been submitted to the Holy See, and then the Holy See, the Holy Office probably would have decided. Maybe not the Holy Office in this case. Would have been the Congregation for Rites. Someone would have addressed this. And we talked in another interview about the lawfulness of priestly operations during such an emergency time in the church. So normally speaking, Father Pierre-Marie would have sent his article to Rome. Father Cekada would have submitted. The Rore Sanctifica people would have sent some books and maybe some croissants. And there would have been a deep study of these issues. And then there would have been an announcement.
Some sort of decree, yes.
So we don't have that. So I've got Father Cekada. This is going to be argued. He went to a cone. Where are his credentials? I mean, he doesn't have a PhD in sacramental theology.
Certainly not, no.
So, well, great. Father, you're entitled to your opinion, and that's great. But it can't be certain. Therefore, I'm going to not really worry myself too much about it. And besides, I only get my sacraments from priests who are ordained by bishops who are consecrated in the pre-1970 rites, so it doesn't really concern me.
It doesn't make any difference.
It doesn't really concern me. So how would you
respond? How would I respond to that? Well,
his father's personal opinion.
Yeah. The thing is, though, that it's a question of the certitude of the sacraments, which is at the sort of at the heart of our fight as traditional Catholics. And if you don't have real sacraments, you don't have real bishops, and you don't have real priests, then that really is a problem. The second thing to be said is that the arguments that we've raised should be in any reasonable person's mind who studies the issue, at least enough to raise somewhat of a doubt. In the case of a sacrament as important as this, you cannot act on the basis of that doubt unless you resolve it, because it's a question of valid or invalid sacraments. So it is indeed a weighty issue, and some one that perhaps people are afraid to address because they're afraid of the consequences, as some people are the question of sedevacantism. But no, I actually had a priest in an indult type of organization, which shall remain nameless, tell me that he had, of course, heard of my study of the new rite of Episcopal Consecration, as had many of his colleagues, but they were afraid to read it because of what the conclusions would be. So a reaction, that was an unsolicited comment, by the way, and that tells me that people who have received orders in this way have, that some of them do in fact have questions about them. There was another priest who made a point of assuring me that he had been consecrated by, or that he had been ordained a priest by a bishop who had been ordained in the new rite. And he said, so I personally then have no worries. So it is an issue that comes up.
So, ignorance is bliss is, I suppose, a great defense sometimes for things that are a little less weighty, whether or not I'm a valid priest. So I suppose it's only more distressing to hear of an anecdote in which a priest of Jesus Christ would not want to
resolve it.
Because I understand, humanly speaking, this has got to be terrifying.
Oh yeah, sure.
And I think that's what makes Father Michael Oswald such a singular case.
Oh yes, yeah.
Had a chance to go to his ordination this summer, which, at least to my knowledge, and I'm always open to being corrected, was the first absolute ordination, non-conditional, of a priest ordained in the new rite by a bishop ordained in the new rite. And to the idea of ideas have consequences, this all came from Father Oswald coming across your article on this, and there were questions that he raised. And so we see the direct consequence of this, a priest stopping celebrating Mass and not doing it again until he was properly ordained. And I think when we look at that, from a lay perspective, that has to be very, very challenging for a priest to step back and say, well, maybe I'm not a priest. Obviously, part of the garb, your daily actions reinforce the notion that you are. So to question that entire world and say, no, I was...
It's to question everything, yes.
I was there has to, and I cannot begin to understand how difficult that must be.
Sure.
So I don't want to play down that this is something simple, either for laymen or for priests, but I suppose if we have a bit of distance, which makes things always easier to look at, we can look at Apostolicae Curiae and look at those alleged Anglican priests who read, who were not afraid to read, and when they read, sought ordination.
Yes.
Either from converting to Catholicism, or they went and doubled down and went to the old Catholics.
Sure.
But we saw that happened. We saw that people read a study, which had been carefully prepared, that raised enough doubts that they said, well, and to this day, that practice perseveres in the alleged, so-called Anglican Church, where some of them will go and double down and go get old Catholic orders. And in the schismatic Chinese Church, this is further complicated by the fact that the official Chinese use the old rite, but the underground Novus Ordo use the new rite.
Yes.
So you have the underground Novus Ordo going to some of the schismatic bishops for Episcopal consecration after they've gone through the Novus Ordo ceremony. So it's clear that this isn't some concern of some priest who some priest who's interested in sacramental theology somewhere in Ohio, but that this has worldwide consequences, and there have been instances in which this point has been directly challenged and the point has had direct consequences. So for Catholics, when confronted with your article or some of the discussions around it, how would you advise them, I don't want to say, to take the news? We talked about Aunt Helen before. Perhaps Aunt Helen is reading this.
Okay.
Aunt Helen is watching this. What does she do with the priest that she's been receiving sacraments from for maybe 10 years? Who's traditional, will hear some of the same things from that sermon.
Well, she can't receive from him.
Might as well be at St. Gertrude, hearing the doctrine, probably agrees with you in many ways, maybe even celebrates the pre-55 liturgy. maybe aligned in a lot of other ways, it's very hard for her to pull herself from that context and say, but maybe at least I'm going to some place where I can be prayerful and
yeah, but if you don't have the sacraments there, you don't really have anything. And that's what is taking place is in effect idolatry, that you are worshiping God who is not there. And that's the effect of it. That's the effect of this particular change. And you have to back up too and understand that the people who put these changes together did so deliberately because they rejected the givens of traditional Catholic theology, the idea of a sacramental form. When I was in the Modernist seminary, the idea of a sacramental form was mocked as magic words. And as a hangover from Thomistic theology that had to be rejected. That was old church, that was the old idea. Also mocked was what they call the pipeline theory of holy orders, that that the sacramental power and sacramental character derived from the apostles through the ordination ceremony, through the imposition of hands. That idea was rejected. And I had professors who reject that. So all of this garbage was in the air at the time that these rites were formulated. So they rejected the idea of a sacramental form. So they gave us a sacramental form in the Rite of Episcopal Consecration that isn't a sacramental form, that misses one of the essential elements, which is the order being conferred. And as far as the pipeline theory, well, in so doing, they managed to cut the pipeline very nicely. But this was what they wanted, because it was a different theology, a different concept of sacramental theology.
Well, obviously, I think, Father, you come across a good point here. If we look at the meta-commentary that we've talked about in several interviews, one on the Mass, and this on that this was not some clumsy mistranslation done by some idiots who happen to have some Latin nearby and they were living in the Apostolic Palace.
Yeah.
These were very intelligent men who knew what they wanted.
Sure.
And specifically wrote these texts in this way. This wasn't a clumsy mistranslation. This was a very studied, intentional wording. And the obviously larger consequences are destruction of the apostolic tradition, destruction of the sacraments, destruction of the church. And obviously, I think we can go into all sorts of speculations, the Masons, etc. And obviously, something like this couldn't be pulled off without help from organizations like the Freemasons.
Sure.
But that's the sort of larger picture. We can get myopic and look at this and say, well, this is a new right. But what is the larger picture? What is happening? And again, we have the benefit of 40 years of hindsight now.
Sure. Yeah.
We can look back and say, wow, they knew what they were doing. They organized their battalions, and they won the day. And here we are all these years later, realizing, well, what does this mean for the church? Where is the church? Where are these bishops? Where are these priests? Are they bishops? Are they priests?
Sure.
I think that's the far more scary thing. Maybe even scarier than sedevacantism, which is, really the scariest thing ever.
I've been told.
I don't think there's anything scarier than that. I have a few objections here, which I think will be brought up.
All right.
Because nobody ever has any objections to anything you write, Father.
No. This is the exception, I'm sure, Steve.
If I don't have metaphysical glasses, can I really have certitude about this at all? I mean, Father's telling me I can't have certitude. I mean, do I really know whenever anything's going on? If Father's up there and, maybe he had a bad day and he forgot what he was doing, and here comes the words of consecration, and Father's kind of slips by. I don't have certitude that he doesn't. Maybe I can't hear Father saying that he's forgiving me in the ego te absolvo.
Yeah.
Therefore, do I have certitude? And so you're just introducing a sort of a real big problem here, is that I'm just going to start doubting everything.
Well, the normal presumption in sacramental theology and canon law is that the minister follows the words of the rite. So that's the normal presumption that you have for the traditional sacraments, and the presumption probably exists in the new church as well. In the post-Vatican II rites, that there's a certain presumption in the law that the priest follows whatever, at least as far as what's considered to be essential, what he's supposed to do. So if that's what you're talking about, that's one thing. But here we have the wild card that's been introduced does not hang, is not dependent on, let's say, the character of the priest, but is actually something in the essential sacramental form of the rite itself. And that's where the doubt occurs. You can see the new form in the new sacramental books. This is what's supposed to be used, and as I've demonstrated, there are considerable difficulties and problems with it. So from that point of view, as we're certain what the form is, and we can say, I think with a fair amount of clarity, what the problems are.
I'm going to step into a bit of apocrypha here,
okay,
Father, because I kind of have to raise some of these objections. Confirmation is a bound power of the priesthood, and perhaps my terminology isn't the best, but a priest can be designated to perform confirmation, or in danger of death, a priest can perform confirmation. So confirmation is clearly not something that's reserved to the episcopate solely. It's ordinarily something that's reserved to a bishop, but you can perform confirmations. Perhaps you have in the course of your ministry over these years had to do that. If that's true, could it not be that a priest can give what he has? So if I'm a priest, I can pass the priesthood on to another person in the same way that perhaps abbots were designated in the Middle Ages to have the power to ordain. And again, I say apocryphally because I wasn't able to find any sources. I don't have the.
Oh, that's discussed in the larger treatises on sacramental theology, and the name of the monastery eventually will occur to me. It was a Cistercian monastery in England, and the authors, the more weighty authors on questions of holy orders, such as I think Maney speaks about that case, and Capello speaks about it, and there are several others. It turns out that there's actually a misunderstanding of the documents. And the documents that the Cistercian abbots received did not, in fact, authorize them personally to ordain people to the priesthood, but something like to have people ordained to the priesthood for their monastery, to pick a bishop to do it. So there's a dispute about the text, but that's all but clearly discussed by the modern authors who've looked at the documents. So the bottom line is that's not the case.
So you wouldn't concede that while confirmation is something that can be done by proxy or designation by a priest, that ordination of another priest can't be done in that way, or at least in the case cited here, that's not.
No, and I think that those authors are fairly clear in affirming that, not only talking about the case, but also saying the general principle, deriving the general principle that you try to derive would be impossible.
So that notion of giving what you have, is that an invalid principle then, Father?
That would not work, from a point of view of sacramental theology.
I think one of the little known facts for those who haven't really looked into these issues is that you haven't someone who agrees with you in the society hierarchy, that Bishop Tessier de Malaray doesn't accept the validity of the new Rite of Episcopal Consecration.
That's the first time I've heard it.
This comes from a letter in which he had said that Bishop Lazo could not perform priestly ordinations.
That's right.
And again, I'm happy to reproduce this letter. Anyone who's watching the interview who wants a copy of the letter, I have it. I can send it on. But in it, Bishop Tissier expresses a doute about the new rite. And someone had pointed out that he had already performed some confirmations, but Bishop Tissier cited Ecclesia Supplet regarding confirmations from Bishop Lazo, but that he didn't want Bishop Lazo participating in priestly ordinations. So at least for Bishop Tissier, and perhaps it may have been through some early Rore Sanctifica stuff that had come to him, he doesn't
accept it.
He doesn't accept. So you at least have one person who agrees with you in the society hierarchy, and perhaps there may be others.
Out of 600 people, it's nice to know that at least one person agrees with me on something.
It's clear that if Bishop Tissier has his own doubts, that this is not something that can be lightly dismissed, especially in a sanctimonious way certainly by laymen, but more so by priests who have simply not put in the time to research this. It's easy to go to the internet, do a search, and then copy and paste a phrase from an article in order to quote unquote refute you. I think it takes a lot more work to actually read and find out. And again, this will go back to someone saying, well, Father, that's all well and good. I go to masses with the Society of St. Pius X. My priest was ordained by Bishop Williamson. Bishop Williamson was ordained by Archbishop. I don't have to worry about it. So, I got other things to do other than read your study. How would you respond to that? Is it this just sort of an academic thing for people like you and me?
It's an important issue because you're going to encounter this more and more. In the Society of St. Pius X context, there are priests who were ordained by Novus Ordo bishops, or bishops who were ordained or who were consecrated in the new rite. And there are priests who are working in this particular environment. And you never know when one is going to show up. So it is an important issue. It absolutely is. And you have to have a way of thinking about it.
There are Novus Ordo clergy who may come across this video or who may have watched part of it up to this point, consider themselves fellow priests with you, and obviously aspire to that life. I don't think the idea is I'm going to discover this and, well, I'm not a priest anymore, I'm just going to leave. I'm sure that they want to continue to practice their ministries. If you had a chance to speak to them or to tell them how to begin, where to start, what to do, what would you say to them?
Well, that's a big question. They would have to assure that they have some sort of a proper theological formation, and then get themselves ordained, properly ordained by a bishop who is validly consecrated.
So you think?
But you have to have both.
You think that Father Oswald's route was probably a sort of template of where I'm going to stop celebrating Mass and then I'm going to go and do some studying to build up towards...
Yes, he did. He certainly did the right thing there. That's exactly what one should do, because it is the theological education one gets in a modern seminary is really quite different. So it's not just a question of the rite, the liturgical rites. There's the other stuff that goes along with it as well.
Do you think it would be permissible for, let's say, a priest operating in the Fraternity of St. Peter or one of these other indult organizations to come and get sub rosa some conditional ordination from, let's say, Bishop Dolan, Bishop Sanborn?
Yeah, I don't think that, I think because of the other considerations that...
Because they probably had proper theological formation in...
Well, I wouldn't necessarily bet on that.
Okay.
At least from what I've heard. I wouldn't necessarily bet on that. And I suppose that there would be, obviously there's going to be hesitation. Someone shows up that in effect you do not know and wants conditional ordination. So I don't think that that's in the practical order really how that would work. It would work more as it has worked for Father Oswald.
Obviously, there's got to be a lot of prayer involved with discovering this, because just on the face of it, intellectually and academically, it looks to be very, very difficult. But I think that if someone's really interested in, especially in the traditional Catholic faith and passing it on to the next generation, that you want to have certitude about this. And I think there's a latent respect of this argument hidden in the fact that they've rejected the new Mass. If you're a traditionalist priest, you've already taken a sacrament and expressed your doubts.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's just, you have to go back a little further and go, well, where did we get this?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the summit and source of a lot of the sacraments comes to us from the episcopacy. So yes, it's definitely scary. It's definitely challenging. I think, as we talked about before we did this interview, this is one of the more difficult interviews that we're going to do, simply because the matter is complicated. But what is not complicated is the fact that it is a duty, responsibility of a thinking Catholic to look at these issues fairly, and not to simply just take the word that this is how we got into this trouble in the first place. Father told us it was just a translation of the Latin into English. Father told us that in Eastern rites they celebrated it this way. Father told us this, and no one checked. And I worry that when we have, hundreds and hundreds of traditionalist priests worldwide, and more bishops than you can count on two hands and two toes, that we can get comfortable and say, well, Father explained it to me, so I'm okay, and I'm just going to Mass. But there's a much, much bigger question here.
There is, and you say that it is a complicated issue. In one sense, it certainly is, but in another, it's not. I mean, the fundamental principles of sacramental theology are fairly cut and dried. That the form, sacramental form, has to express what it's supposed to affect. And in the case of the new Rite of Episcopal Consecration, it doesn't. There are two elements it's got to have. According to Pius XII, it's got to have the grace of the Holy Ghost and the order that's being expressed, that's being conferred. And you don't have that. Spiritus Principalis, if it means the Holy Ghost, then the order being conferred is not being expressed. If it means the episcopacy, then the grace of the Holy Ghost is not being expressed. And you can't lump the two together. So from that point of view, it's from the straight sort of black letter Thomistic theology, the issue is actually fairly clear. Where one consumes the time is trying to look at the different possible objections to the arguments against it, trying somehow to justify the validity for it. That's where you end up running down the rabbit hole. But when you get down to it, it's a fairly simple issue. There's those two elements, and it doesn't have two of them. It doesn't have the two elements that are required. And therefore, the only conclusion is that it's invalid.
And Father, I think as you would always challenge people to do who don't believe you or don't want to take your word for it, you would tell them to go look it up.
Look it up. Yeah.
And you can find out yourself. Just a fair warning to anybody, this involves reading, leafing through dusty tomes, and probably a little bit of research. So
yeah, and on the other hand, if some of these, if the points that I've raised in this article were, let us say, rather easily refuted, I'm sure someone would have tried it by this, would have tried to do it by this time. But there are really only 3 attempts at a response, only one of which was somewhat substantive, throughout the whole traditionalist world. So there is a question as to what kind of response you can come up with, at least in terms of traditional Catholic theology on the essential sacramental form.
Well, we've taken up a lot of your time. Thank you very much, Father.
My pleasure.